Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It is an absolute pleasure to welcome you here this morning. My name is Richard Evans. This morning we're going to hear from two authors who are ornaments to public history, people who do an exceptionally good job of researching meticulous, thorough, but also entertaining and accessible accounts of our common past, in particular in Australia. I'm going to be particularly interested to hear what they have to say about our topic, which is a quote, as I understand it, from Napoleon, who said that history is but a fable agreed upon. It is, of course, neither of those things, but it is also true to some extent, as we will discuss in the course of the morning. James Boyce lives in Tasmania, and he has previously contributed one of the chapters to Whitewash, the book about Keith Shuttle's take on Aboriginal history. Also the author of God's Own Country, a discussion of the Anglican Church and its relationship with Tasmanian Aborigines. Van Diemen's Land, the penal colony at the bottom of the world, is the subject of the latest book by our first speaker, James Boyce.
Thank you, Richard. It's good to be here. I was just thinking it's slightly scary taking on Napoleon. It was reminding me of I spent many years on my book, and the most famous Lieutenant Governor of Van Diemen's Land was a bloke called George Arthur. Very strong personality, very effective administrator, very influential man. And I started off the book with quite a sympathetic view of George Arthur. Started my research, and over the years got more and more of a negative, became more in touch with the negative side, I suppose you could say, until you probably end up with a fairly damning indictment of many of his policies. And I can, right through the process, it's like he's just there, tut-tutting, tut-tut, James. I can feel him, he's so close. And it's a bit like with Napoleon, isn't it? Some of these people are so large and so present, it's almost like their personalities never quite die. But we've still got to do it. We've got to take on Napoleon, just like we had to take on George Arthur. It's a historian's duty. And because his history certainly is not a fable. It might make me sound very old-fashioned to say so, but history is concerned with what happened to real people in real places. And nor is the purpose of history to find agreement. Indeed, one of the defining differences between history and fable is surely that history's version of what happened in the past can be disputed. We can critique fables as we can critique historical fiction in many different ways, but not by saying these writers have got their understanding of the past wrong. Since these genres don't claim to accurately depict what happened in the past in the first place, any difference we might have in the way they interpret people and events is really besides the point. It is, however, very much the point of history and of historical criticism. So, having very quickly disposed of Napoleon, who we will return to later, we can acknowledge that there are many obvious limitations and constraints of history. These are often used to discredit empirical history, but usually end up doing little more than pointing out the limitations of human existence. For example, the fact that everything we know about the past is limited, and all is mediated through the present, including historical facts, doesn't mean we can't try and understand the past, and some attempts at understanding will be much closer to objective truth than others. These sorts of limitations apply in different ways to all human activity and scholarly disciplines, including the so-called hard science. They even apply to how we interpret and make sense of our own lives. Thus, the reality that an historian is inevitably part of the making of history, and the present always influences how we see the past, is no cause for panic or even surprise. A much more serious limitation of empirical history is that the written documents on which it largely depends have been largely produced by a very small group. In early 19th century Australian history, this problem is acute in relation to the convicts, who comprise the majority of settlers but write very little. We thus know them largely through the observation of their masters. This problem is even more serious, of course, in relation to the Aborigines, who do not have a culture of the written word. And thus, again, we know almost everything about early contact and early conflict through the observation of this same small group of Europeans. But this time, of course, the cultural gulf is much wider, and the people writing about Aborigines have very little understanding of the people they're writing about. So awareness of these different limitations of empirical history, however, are not new, and they've been mainstream in historiography for well over half a century and discussed in philosophical and religious traditions in different ways for very much longer again. Really, it's only the 19th century positivist historians who believe that the past exists as a definite, discoverable collection of facts which the historian has only to add to until one day we will get the complete picture. They are the odd ones out here, products of a century where the belief in progress was elevated almost to religious faith, just as we now believe in growth, although we, unlike them, seem to have forgotten why. It is noteworthy that the most famous exponent of this school, the English historian Acton, never himself actually got round to writing any history, and complained by the end of his life that with the sheer accumulation of new facts and documents, these threatened to turn the historian from a man of letters into the compiler of an encyclopedia. So, if history is not a fable, nor just an accumulation of significant facts, what is it? Good history, as Inge Clendinnen noted in her excellent quarterly essay, The History Question, Who Owns the Past, is, and I quote, so difficult to describe, yet so recognisable in action. Clendinnen talks of historical method as intelligent observation which can transform understanding. And surely one defining feature of such observation is an obsession with context. Nothing can be understood and everything can potentially mislead without immersion in context. Some delving into the Bonaparte quote given us to by the good folk of the Melbourne Writers Festival reveals this truth as well as any. When I saw that famous Napoleon quote was to form the basis of our discussion, I was interested in seeing what context he made the comment. Was it at the height of his imperial power or from lonely exile in St Helena? Was it part of his written memoirs, or had it been recorded from a conversation? Was it made in jest or seriousness? That is, just what did he mean by it? My first guess was it sounded like Napoleon was making the point that whoever won the war would frame the history of the war, because people have always known how quickly and easily the victors become the good guys. Well, I haven't done a lot of research on this, but it seems that my guess was wrong, that in fact Napoleon never even said history is but a fable agreed on. Rather, it was American thinker and former Unitarian minister Ralph Waldo Emerson in a famous essay published in 1841 that was simply called History. Emerson attributed the quote to Napoleon, and it seems like that people ever since have simply repeated the line and its source until it has become one of the late emperor's most famous sayings. I don't know how this occurred, or even if Emerson was aware that he'd misquoted Bonaparte, but we do know this detail wouldn't have worried him, because Emerson was not an empirical historian. He was one who believed it was important to try. He was not one who believed it was important to try and accurately convey the past. Rather, history was for Emerson fodder, like fable, for the moral journey. Let me read out the paragraph from the essay in which our imperial pronouncement got its Guernsey. The world exists for the education of each man. He must sit solidly at home and not suffer himself to be bullied by kings or empires, but know that he is greater than all the geography and all the government of the world. He must transfer the point of view from which history is commonly received, from Rome and Athens and London, to himself. No anchor, no cable, no fences are available to keep a fact a fact. The Garden of Eden is poetry transformed to all nations. Who cares what the fact was, when we have made a constellation of it to hang in heaven as an immortal sign? London and Paris and New York must go the same way. What is history, said Napoleon, but a fable agreed upon. Thus, for Emerson, it was not the historical truth that matters, but the meaning behind the story. The past, indeed the present, is on the same level of reality as the Garden of Eden. Seen as a fable, it can transform us. Reduced to a real people with real place with real people, it dies. Thus, the context for the quote we've been given turns out not to be a critical reflection about the victors getting to write and determine history, but more likely a positive claim by a later American thinker about the potential transformative moral power of history when its true status as fable is affirmed. Now, does this detail matter? To me, it is important we get such points right, at least when we claim to be writing history. And the evidence, I believe, suggests that it matters to others. Ample warning of both the cultural importance attributed to empirical history, its current vulnerability, and the potentially disastrous consequences should either historians or the community ever give up on it, has been provided recently by the so-called history wars. Keith Winchuttle argued in Fabrication of Aboriginal History, Volume 1, Van Diemen's Land, that historians have been engaged in a deliberate fabrication. Not just got it wrong or made a mistake, but engaged in a deliberate fabrication for political purposes. The historians of what Winchuttle called the orthodox school in Tasmania, those who believed that the Aborigines had been engaged in warfare with the British to defend their land and people and had been killed in high numbers, have been researching and writing now for over 150 years, and they come from very different political traditions. Winchuttle asked us to believe that 19th century liberals and conservatives like John West, James Calder and James Bonwick, with an equally diverse range of contemporary historians, were in truth fable writers and only pretending to be otherwise. On any measure, this was a highly improbable, even bizarre thesis. And the truth is, of course, there has been no fabrication. The reason that the broad thesis of the so-called orthodox school has held sway since Henry Melville wrote the history of Van Diemen's Land in 1833 is the obvious one, because there was a very high level of violence and there is plenty of documentary evidence to prove it. There have been and still are many differences between historians, and the odd mistake certainly has been made, but historians overall have done their job. What could so easily have been forgotten, an important part of the truth of our founding story, still not easy to live with, has been told. And its empirical foundation is such that I believe any fair-minded person reviewing the evidence must dismiss the counter-history proposed by Winchuttle that the supposedly inherently dysfunctional nature of Aboriginal society and not the consequences of white settlement was the reason why almost all Aborigines were dead by the 1830s. We needed empirical history and not just moral outrage, as legitimate as this is, to prove that Winchuttle's shocking conclusion was wrong. And thank goodness the necessary work had been done in Tasmania and that historians did not surrender to the widespread view that the fabrication of Aboriginal history was simply presenting a different version of our past, which had as much claim to truth as any other. The history wars warned us that if historians ever do stop doing empirical history, our culturally sanctioned modus operandi, there will be a cultural void, and that void we can sure will be filled. Yes, there are other important and necessary ways of knowing and communicating the past, but these are not the work of the historian. None of this is to suggest that history can or should be separated from morality or politics. The questions historians are interested in often emerge from contemporary concerns. Indeed, with my little time left, it's time I got a bit more personal here and talked of the background to my book, lest I never get round to mentioning it. One of my motivations for writing Van Diemen's Land was to critique two legends about European Tasmania. These were not fables. As Inge Glendinning points out in relation to the so-called Anzac myth, when stories concern real people and real places, they are more accurately described as legends, that is, traditional stories popularly regarded as historical. The first legend I was concerned with was the view that Tasmania was some sort of Little England, or at least an idealised late 18th century rural version of it, and that it was in Tasmania that the Antipodean desire to recreate the English homeland socially and environmentally came closest to perfection. The second was the convict legend enduringly depicted by Marcus Clarke in For the Term of His Natural Life. This saw Van Diemen's Land as a hell on earth, a place where empire and nature worked together to create a byword for horror. Clarke's book was, of course, a work of fiction, but interesting in terms of what we were talking about before. The author went out of his way to emphasise that it was all based on real-life events, and this claim has been critical to the book's enduring influence. The first of these legends, I suggest, can be depicted as the founding legend of Tasmania, the second, the founding legend of Van Diemen's Land. Just how the two legends related to each other is not clear. Van Diemen's Land, it seems, simply vanished and died with the end of transportation in 1853, and the name changed to Tasmania in 1856. Now, there is, of course, truth in both stories. Many of you would have visited the Port Arthur or Macquarie Harbour penal sites and seen what the convict system could be for yourself. Perhaps on your trip you also drove between Launceston and Hobart along what is now badged the Heritage Highway. And here the legacy of Little England can still be seen, the Georgian architecture, the hedgerows, beautiful deciduous trees and so on. So given there was a truth in both these legends, why was I concerned to examine them? One reason was I thought the legends had become so pervasive that it was widely assumed they told the whole story when they told only a part of it. They'd been given a status and explanatory power far beyond what the evidence allowed. Secondly, I did not believe they had much at all to say to the most basic question of all: what sort of society was made in Van Diemen's Land by the ordinary settlers, who are overwhelmingly convicts and former convicts, and how was this culture and society shaped by the particular land they'd been exiled to? Port Arthur, Macquarie Harbour and even the Blackbirds often seemed to me they could be anywhere. How is this Tasmanian history when it seems so unshaped by Tasmania or the majority of its people? The final and related problem, and I'm just about finished, was that both legends seem to have lost their capacity to engage with the present. Since the late Pedder campaign in the early 1970s, environmental disputes have been tearing the Tasmanian community apart. In this context, it was important, I believe, that history provides the community with an informed understanding of how Europeans have engaged with the land. Because this hadn't occurred, many believe that the European relationship with the environment had amounted to little more than 200 years of destruction before modern environmental sensibility emerged. In turn, this fostered a counter-mythology in which vested interests could present themselves, quite improbably, as the defenders of the people's traditional ties and dependence on the land. Indeed, the gap in our history meant that any self-interested player could create their own myth unchallenged, and the past was widely used to exacerbate division and fear within the community for crude political ends. I'm not suggesting for a moment that my book has answered the questions I describe, which will surely be a long and ongoing process, but only that this was part of what initially motivated me. And going back to our topic, if a historian is to speak to his or her culture, although we don't need a fable to agree on, we do perhaps need to listen very carefully to its concerns. Ralph Waldo Emerson might have been right about how to read and write about the Garden of Eden, but he was wrong about Paris, New York and London, and for that matter, Melbourne and Hobart. These were and are real places, populated by real people, and if their history is to be told, they deserve and need much more than fables. Thank you.